Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, did you know that Buddhas can have different skin colors? Some are blue, red, green, gold, and even pure white, like a cloud.
I didn't know that, but I suppose it makes sense. Buddhahood is open and available to beings of many forms, shapes, sizes, and colors. It would follow that their skin color would be a reflection of their unique qualities.
Indeed. I've learned that blue skin is reflective of sublimated rage and fury. These Buddhas exhibited fierce rage and then transformed that unwholesome energy into pure and beneficial energy that is entirely directed toward the realization of one's own enlightenment, as well as that of all sentient beings.
Fascinating. It must take great skill to take something as toxic as hatred and fury and sublimate it into something wholesome, such that it affects the skin color of the Buddha.
Indeed. Such things can also influence some of these figures' ritual tools. For example, some of these angry Buddhas and Bodhisattvas can even have swords or other weapons as their ritual implements, signifying that their weapons, once used for killing, are now used for cutting away attachments, suffering, and delusion, or enlightening sentient beings in different realms.
Truly, Buddhahood can make use of anything and everything available to help lead sentient beings to enlightenment.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing Akshobhya. Who is Akshobhya? What are some stories about him? How is he depicted in iconography? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get to it. Who is Akshobhya?
Akshobhya is one of the many Buddhas in the Mahayana and Vajrayana pantheon. His name in Sanskrit translates to immovable one, or Buddha of immovable wisdom. He's one of several Buddhas in the pantheon who are actually said to have the characteristic of immovability, and that immovability is a reference to the stalwart nature of their meditative concentration. Akshobhya's name in Chinese is Achu Rulai, and his name in Japanese is Ashuku Nyorai. As you can see, attached to his name in either language is the title Rulai or Nyorai. This title is a translation of Tathagata, meaning thus come one, into Chinese and Japanese respectively. The character Nyo or Ru means thus, and Lai or Rai means to come. Akshobhya is one of the 5 wisdom Buddhas. These 5 Buddhas are all representations or manifestations of the Adibuddha, which is the Sanskrit word referring to the concept of an original or primordial Buddha that we see in the Lotus Sutra. This concept is famously presented in the Lotus Sutra, where we learn that all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are manifestations of this original primordial Buddha. This primordial Buddha is identified with many different Buddhas in different respective schools of Buddhism. For example, in Pure Land, the Adibuddha is closely identified with Amida. In Shingon, the Adibuddha is Vairocana, and in Zen, the Adibuddha is Shakyamuni. The 5 wisdom Buddhas are also attributed to encompass directions in which they have their Pure Lands. These 5 are Amoghasiddhi to the north, Amida to the west, Akshobhya to the east, Ratnasambhava to the south, and Vairocana in the center. Akshobhya's Pure Land in the east is called Abhirati, and it is a very interesting place because for a great deal of Pure Land Buddhism's history, this Pure Land was equally as popular, if not more so, than Amida's Pure Land. That is to say that in history, many Pure Land devotees sought rebirth in Akshobhya's Pure Land, not just in Amida's. Akshobhya first comes up in the Akshobhya Tathagata Syavyuha Sutra, where his Pure Land is described in greater detail. This text is one of the oldest texts in the Pure Land genre of sutras and was first translated into Chinese from Sanskrit in the 2nd century CE. In it, the story of how Akshobhya became a Buddha is described. The text presents a monk who wished to practice the Dharma in the eastern lands and who made a vow not to feel any anger or malice towards any being on his path to achieving enlightenment.
So I note that this vow allows for anger or malice after achieving enlightenment. So based on what we have talked about in previous episodes, it kind of makes sense because part of being enlightened is being able to automatically direct that kind of energy in a beneficial way. Part of the idea of skillful means would be that, like, if you are an enlightened being, then by the concept of skillful means, if you are feeling rage or anger at something, it is because by skillful means, that rage or anger is what is needed for whatever the subject to get closer to enlightenment.
Exactly. And that's a very fascinating part of it. For an unenlightened being, anger and ill will are very unwholesome. If you have these things, then you're breaking one of the precepts. You're not advancing on the path at all, and you're creating bad karma for yourself. But for an enlightened being, they are by definition incapable of exhibiting unwholesome traits. So this is something that would really disqualify you from being called enlightened if you exhibited anything unwholesome. But that doesn't mean that you can't exhibit anger and rage. Mahayana Buddhism attempts time and time again to expand the definition of enlightened beings, and it tries to rail against the moral absolutism that's seen in the Theravada teachings and in earlier texts. As a result, this definition of enlightened beings comes to encompass beings who have these unwholesome qualities, but the thought process has changed such that these unwholesome qualities are seen to have a wholesome aspect. Like we see in the Vimalakirti Sutra and the Lotus Sutra and in esoteric Buddhism, passions and extreme emotions are seen to be enlightening qualities in our daily lives because they teach us the nature of dukkha and therefore the nature of the Dharma. And in the Mahayana, it is unfounded to say that the best or only way to learn about the Dharma or enter the realm of enlightenment is through strictly wholesome and pure means. The distinction exists between wholesome and unwholesome, pure and impure, but it doesn't have the same hierarchical value judgment in Mahayana that it might have had in earlier teachings and texts. All paths to enlightenment are equally valid so long as it's Mahayana enlightenment and not Theravada enlightenment. Moreover, the thing is that you need to meet all sentient beings exactly where they're at. If the thing that they need to reach enlightenment is a violent and ragey character, then that's what they need, and that's what the Buddha will provide. So once a being becomes enlightened, they instantly get all knowledge of what a being needs to see or experience in order to reach enlightenment, and they also get to sublimate all of their unwholesome qualities into enlightened qualities. All of their unwholesome qualities and characteristics suddenly take on a salvific, divine, and ineffably positive nature. So, as a result, even anger is automatically righteous and beneficial to all sentient beings, no matter what. It becomes a skillful application of the unwholesome quality in the interest of saving sentient beings, and is therefore totally wholesome. If it is not in the interest of saving all sentient beings, it's not enlightened, and it would disqualify you from being enlightened, so those things don't count. Now back to Akshobhya. He succeeded in this vow of abstinence from anger, and this earned him the title of immovable. When he reached his Buddhahood, he became the Buddha Akshobhya. His Pure Land Apirati is described as being very mountainous, as opposed to Amida's Pure Land, which is described as being perfectly and evenly flat. Additionally, unlike Amida's Pure Land, women are allowed to be reborn in Apirati in their very bodies. You'll remember that Amida's Pure Land requires women to be reborn or transformed into a man's body in order to be able to be reborn there. You may be thinking how feminist of Akshobhya to let women into his Pure Land, but actually there's a specific doctrinal reason for this distinction. When one is reborn into Amida's Pure Land, they're reborn automatically as a bodhisattva, and the idea is that their very next death will be the one where they reach final nirvana. However, when one is reborn in Apirati, they are reborn as either an arhat or a bodhisattva, and thus nuns are allowed. Thus, while one may want to interpret this Pure Land as being more inclusive, the idea is that this Pure Land is of a more inferior level than Amida's, which is why lower-level practitioners and women can be reborn there.
There's a lot that went through that paragraph that we touched on in our Vajrasekhara series as well, so A lot of this, if you're listening to everything, probably sounds pretty similar. So, let's get back to Akshobhya. What are some stories about him?
If you remember, Akshobhya actually comes up in the Vimalakirti Sutra. In chapter 11 of the sutra, which we will read and discuss soon, trademark, it is revealed that Vimalakirti isn't just a playboy who somehow has managed to master the Dharma, and it turns out he's actually friends with Shakyamuni and is able to preach and teach to his disciples. Indeed, he is actually a fully realized bodhisattva from the realm of Abhirati. To demonstrate that this is indeed the case, Vimalakirti uses his magical powers to wholly transport the realm of Abhirati into the garden where the Buddha and his audience are assembled. This is but one of several examples in the Vimalakirti Sutra where space is manipulated in magical ways. For example, the most famous instance of this is Vimalakirti's hut, which is supposed to be a mere 10 feet by 10 feet, but it is able to have room for the Buddha's whole audience and hundreds of thrones in it that are thousands of feet tall. So when Vimalakirti shows them all Abhirati, Shakyamuni predicts that everyone will be reborn there in the future. This is fascinating because it is an example of some characters getting multiple prophecies. Some of the named disciples of the Buddha's audience are given prophecies of future rebirth in other texts as well. So this implies that some of them will be reborn into one Pure Land first, and then another, and then a heaven, and then finally will become a Buddha and have their own Buddha realm somewhere. Another depiction of Akshobhya, of course, is the Vajrasekhara Sutra. In the construction of the diamond realm mandala in that text, Akshobhya, or Ashuku, takes up his place to the east of Vairocana, and his mudra is the earth-touching seal, where one hand is draped face down over the knee and the middle fingertip is touching the ground, and the other hand is held in the lap or in a fist. The origin of this mudra is Shakyamuni getting ready to preach the Four Noble Truths in his first sermon. He is said to have called on the earth spirits, or the wisdom of the earth, to witness his new teaching and his new sermon with the downward hand, and the other hand signified his continued meditation and concentration. Finally, there is a story of how he attained the title of immovable. He's much more strongly associated with wisdom and compassion than other characters who have the same title of immovable, such as Akala or Fudo Myo-o. So his immovability is more associated with the immovability of his compassion for sentient beings, whereas, for example, Fudo Myo-o's immovability is related to his role as a protector of Dharma practitioners and as a banisher of delusions and attachments. However, there have been times in esoteric Buddhism's history where these two figures have been merged and even worshipped as a single figure. For example, both Fudo Myo-o and Akshobhya's skins are frequently depicted as blue in iconography.
So, let's get to that more in detail. How is he depicted in iconography?
So as we've been saying, most frequently he's depicted with blue or black skin. Skin color is very important, especially in esoteric Buddhist iconography. There are several skin colors you'll see in esoteric iconography such as white, green, red, gold, blue, black, and more. These are representative of associations and natures that these figures may have. For example, Vairocana will sometimes have pure white skin to represent empty space, or all-pervading light that represents wisdom. Blue skin represents an extremely high level of emotional energy, such as anger, viciousness, rage, and fury, that's been transformed into energy devoted toward enlightenment. Amita's skin is red, for example, signifying that he has less of this rage funneled into energy devoted toward his enlightenment. Gold signifies the nature of the Dharma as being a very rich treasure, and green actually represents envy and jealousy being transformed into enlightenment energy, funnily enough. I'm not 100% certain if this imagery from India and Asia is the root of the green with jealousy idiom, but it's interesting that both of these occur. What's fascinating about Akshobhya's blue skin in particular is the fact that he became a Buddha and earned the title of immovable by abstaining from anger and ill will until he reached enlightenment. By my interpretation, there are a couple of possible things going on here. On the one hand, we should mention that Akshobhya's iconography has not always been consistent. There are also some depictions of him out there with gold skin, white skin, or even black skin. That's simply because iconography practices have not always been the same everywhere throughout all of history. Different colors have had different associations and significances to different people at different times. We should also note that Akshobhya was historically sometimes merged with Akala, or Fudo Myo-o, and that is a possible reason for his blue skin. There may have been some drift in the sense that Akala had his association with rage and fury, and although Akshobhya didn't, that rage and fury was carried over with him.
So, an aside that I want to put here. A long time ago, just going down a rabbit hole, I ended up hearing about some issues that came up with European illustrations and iconography. So, at the time, there was a type of ink that had a shiny silver color, so it was often used to depict armor, so chainmail and plate and that kind of thing. However, the way the ink was created, the ink itself was not well created, and so over time that ink faded into this dull, ugly black. So you see some illustrations that were supposed to be depicting soldiers in silvery chainmail, and instead they look like they're wearing a bunch of gunk. I wonder if something similar might be happening here that might be making identifying the iconography more tricky. Maybe we're looking at images that started as blue and then faded to a different color over time.
There are definitely some interesting art historical concerns and preservation concerns that factor in here. Not only are they related to how different colors have different meanings and significance to different cultures at different times, but there are also certain pigments that were and were not widely available in certain places, and there are also different image-making practices that led to different results. All of these factors combined with environmental situations, and that means that different icons from different places had differing amounts of longevity and resilience against the elements over time, and it meant that they faded differently and that they aged differently. Because of all of this, artwork and religious relics can be as useful as archaeological evidence, if not more so, in crafting a complete picture of societies in places and cultures that are separated from our own by a lot of time and geography. In the case of Akshobhya's blue skin, I'm not 100% sure if in every case the blue skin was faded from a different color. Sometimes he also had green skin, which signifies jealousy, and Akala or Fudo Myo never has green skin. And also, in the case of blue skin on paintings and blue skin on statues, even if the image in the painting faded, the statue usually lasted quite a bit longer. So we could see that even if something didn't look the right color in a painting, we could cross-reference it with a statue using other clues such as what he's holding or what he's doing in the statue depiction and see, okay, that's Akshobhya, but he's blue. And this is the more resilient sort of ink and sort of construction style. So therefore, this must be Akshobhya, and therefore he must be blue. It's all very confusing, and it doesn't make a lot of sense that he has sort of this anti-anger, anti-rage aspect up until he becomes enlightened. It must be that all of this anger and rage is bottled up. And so it's very fascinating. So while the previously mentioned interpretations are all valid and likely, I like the challenge of interpreting his blue skin in light of his immovability. In esoteric Buddhism and in some schools of Mahayana Buddhism, there's a doctrine which is called non-interference or non-occlusion, or I've also heard non-obstruction. And it refers to the fact that two seemingly contradictory or paradoxical things can be simultaneously true and valid at the same time due to a couple of factors. One factor is the relativity of experience due to karmic circumstances. A human being perceives water as life-giving and vital, while a hungry ghost is burned severely by it. Another factor is the fact that there is no such possible thing as absolute truth that obfuscates or negates another truth. This is emptiness. For there to be an absolute truth, something would have to exist in some superior or more persistent or permanent form than something else, which isn't permissible due to emptiness or impermanence. Things only exist conditionally. So one thing can't be more capital T true than something else because both truths are subject to causes and conditions. Now, quick note, the Dharma does not exist in the sense of the word we are using here, so it's exempt from this principle. What I'm talking about is something tangible, such as the color of the sky. The two truths, the sky is blue and the sky is not blue, are both equally true and equally not true, because each one is similarly subject to causes and conditions, whereas being subject to causes and conditions is the Dharma itself and is not falsifiable in that same sense. The sky is blue because gases in the atmosphere have a particular refractive property with regards to the sun's light. If the atmosphere and the sun were to change, as they inevitably will due to impermanence, then the color of the sky will change, like it does during a sunset or when there's heavy smog. Similarly, the sky is not blue, because blue is a characteristic of our sensory organs, which can only perceive a fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. If our eyes could perceive more than just the visible light spectrum, we would see that the sky is not blue. We would perceive it as not being blue at all. Neither of these truths obfuscates the other. This is to say nothing of color blindness. There is relativity and variety even among human sensory experiences, which further complicate this issue, but it also further supports the notion of non-occlusion or non-interference. In the case of Akshobhya and his anger, he can be angry and not angry at the same time due to this doctrine of non-occlusion. For example, maybe in reserving his anger on his path to enlightenment, he bottled it up, like I said before. Similarly, maybe his blue skin is not entirely due to rage and fury, but could be due to stalwart mindfulness and concentration. Usually that causes a Buddha's skin to be gold or white, but in this case, it could have been blue. Extreme zeal and religious fervor can lead to blue skin instead of white or gold skin because the extremity of the zeal or fervor is no longer a factor of calmness, but rather the opposite. Concentration and stalwart mindfulness are usually related to calmness, whereas zeal and fervor can be very uncalm expressions, and thus his blue skin could come from that. Due to the doctrine of non-interference, I think all of these will be equally valid interpretations of his iconography. Also, remember that unwholesome things like anger and rage and fury have a wholesome, enlightened aspect, and so to say that he's angry and not angry at the same time would make a lot of sense. Because if he was truly unwholesomely angry, he wouldn't be enlightened, but he is. So he's not unwholesomely angry, he's wholesomely angry if he is angry at all. So it's a very interesting kind of circular discussion that can trap you in a loop sometimes.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Akshobhya. Join us next week where we will be discussing special religious items in Japanese Buddhism known as omamori. What are omamori? What is their history? What is their significance? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
See you next time. Thank you for listening. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of hearer.
And I'm Dox, editor, question asker, and voice of hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.